the changes in State Department last 10 years, essentially it's been gutted. I mean, it's a shadow of itself with regard to funding. Maybe now it's gotten better, but even during Obama's time, they're cutting funding, cutting staff and stuff. And we're seeing it now when we deal with consular officers. It just a lot of posts don't have they have what is called like acting chief and all that kind of stuff. Have you seen maybe behind the scenes? Is it the State Department said they're rehiring, and by I think October of last month they're starting the rehiring and reopening process, bringing new people on board. Have you seen that behind the scenes with your connections that things are getting restaffed, or is it still starving for manpower or people power, personnel, and money? How does that look from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, at the end of the day, the landscape has fundamentally changed. We were talking a little bit before we started recording here. I just recently worked with a national basketball team that was playing in the United States. They reached out in September. We're talking now in November 2022. They reached out in September for an appointment for B1, B2s to come to play in this tournament. It was a FIBA-sanctioned International Basketball Federation tournament. And the first available appointments were not until March of 2025. And so that comes at the end of a 12-month period in which the Department of State has adjudicated more visas than they did in 2019. And most people don't realize that. In terms of overall adjudications, the numbers are almost where they were pre-pandemic. The problem is the demand is so much higher and the backlog is so much higher. And so I think it's, there's more people from a financial perspective. There's more affluence, there's more of an interest globally in traveling to the United States. And so the demand remains high for B1, B2s. There's more job opportunities. And so there's more employment-based visa cases that did get held up during the pandemic. So the backlog there is more substantial. So I would say that's tourist visas. I don't think overall the number of specific work visas and Fs necessarily at the same number as 2019, but I just think the demand is so much higher. They have devoted more funding. They have made hiring, but just like we talked about, when I was hired into the Foreign Service, I was hired in June of 2009. I didn't get to Ecuador for my first post until April of 2010. So it just takes time to train them, to give them a language if they need be, to facilitate the move and everything that needs to takes place for a diplomat to move from the United States to another country. Because they don't just show up and are adjudicating 250 NIV cases a day, right? Because it's not just the immigration process that you have to understand, the computer systems. It's also the linguistic element, right? Because you're doing those interviews in another language more often than not. So getting that down, understanding what they're saying, and then understanding the culture of a country. So you start to understand, again, going back to Ecuador. Travelers were often going, they would older applicants on paper were pretty bad applicants, right? Because they didn't really have a job. They were grandparents. They had family in the United States. But once you got to understand it, they didn't want to live in Queens. They'd go for 4 months, take care of their grandkids, spend some time there, and then they come back to Ecuador. Yeah. So, it just takes some time to understand that, no, they're not going there to live. Everybody in front of you is not misrepresenting themselves and wants to live in the United States. Even if their economic situation is not one that you can necessarily relate to, it doesn't mean that, that they're lying.
Yeah, I was talking to a former consular officer a couple months back, and he said when I first got into the embassy, what I considered marriage fraud was the opposite. About 5 years later, I was thinking I was completely different analysis after 5 years. Yeah. The things I would assume that I was fraud was no, it's just people's lives. It's not what you think about it. And then the indicators completely change from experience, and that takes time. All this takes time. Unfortunately, for human beings all over the world, and particularly America, we have this thing okay, just stuff some officers there and it's going to turn. And it's no, I tell clients because they're frustrated too. I'm this is just a slow process. It's human beings. They got to know. It's better you get more training so you don't make mistakes on the line, if anything, because fixing on mistakes is going to be such a headache.
And that's a great point, John, because it's not just throwing officers at the demand and chopping away, because if you do that, then you end up with more people denied, perhaps 214, they receive a 214B ruling, and therefore they just apply again. So then you're not really cutting into the demand. Maybe you clear off the initial case, but then it just comes back in another way, and it's more time, it's more work. And so you absolutely want to make sure those cases are adjudicated properly.